hello, hi, friends and relatives. Welcome to another episode of The Glorious Mess featuring me, a glorious mess, here to talk about something I think that is really important, and that is childhood. Clearly, each and every one of us, if you're listening, has been through childhood. I don't know if any children are listening, but if you are, like, make sure your parents are on top of shit now because it's important. But childhood is, we're looking at those early years and how they show up and manifest in our adult selves, how our inner child dictates some of our kind of core beliefs, core emotions, and really shapes who we are. And it's nuanced, it's complex, it shows up in different ways. And I have definitely done a lot of work in this area and still a shit ton more of work that needs to be done. Um, and I'm sure my wonderful, phenomenal guest, who is none other than my dear brother, Tyrell, is also joining this really important conversation. And yeah, hi, Ty.
What's up?
Welcome to the Glorious Mess. Is this your first ever podcast?
Yes, it is actually. Although we've participated in how many over our years here on the phone and with my friends, and we're always like, oh, we should just do a podcast. Why don't we? So I'm really happy to see that you're like actually doing this now.
Doing it. I'm doing it. And yeah, honestly, I always think like we've had so many valuable, like, I'm like, wow, it's been like so long. We had this conversation and so many, so many different, wow, I need to clear my throat. There we go. So many different like journeys and learnings and things. I remember like, I don't know, when I used to be on the cruise ship and I would call you in Mexico when I had like cell phone service and have like a good long chat while I'm like walking down the beach in Mexico. So
Yeah,
yeah, this is just them, except for it lives on the internet, which means it lives forever.
yeah. Oh God.
So like tell me from your perspective, like how important is childhood to you? Like what does childhood mean and what does that meant for you generally?
Okay, so I'm gonna start with quoting a fellow TikToker that I don't know who said the quote, but
Mhm.
it was he was in therapy and he was basically his therapist told him that protect the boy, the man will appear.
Mm.
And it, like when I heard that, it took me a long time to actually internalize it because I was like, "What do you mean? That doesn't it doesn't initially make sense."
Mhm.
But it was more so about what I took in the interpretation and what I took from it was that I had to be who I am, like the person I am today, the man I am today,
Mhm.
has to go back when I'm either triggered or having memories or reoccurring thoughts of my childhood, and be the one to show up and hug that boy.
Mm.
And so, like, to show up to be like, it's okay. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because as you know, or maybe you don't know fully, but there wasn't a lot of anybody around for me, especially.
Mhm.
Do you know what I
No
mean?
way.
Like,
No.
like, and I like, I'm not trying to throw shade at mom, you know
Mhm.
what I mean? But like, she just was battling her own stuff,
Yeah.
and her being extremely, like, as you know, she's only 15 years older than me, six or
Yeah.
16, right? So she was still going through her journey too, and to try and raise a man when she hasn't even become a woman.
Yeah.
Put it
I
in.
really think that the most important thing, I really love what you said about, yeah, like your adult self has to parent that inner child, especially if there was like an absence of it. And I know for us, and we'll go into that a bit more of like childhood was chaotic, for lack of a better word.
Mhm.
It was a glorious mess. I'll just say mess all the time. Um,
That's a perfect statement. Yeah.
yeah. And it wasn't, I always tell people too, like, and anyone listening, like, remember I was telling Fred about my childhood, and he was like, "Oh, that's so sad." It's like,
Mhm.
it's sad, but it's also glad. I'm just a rhyming. I'm a lyricist here, but like it's bittersweet. It was sad, and there was sad moments, and there's work that I need to do, but there was also really joyous moments. And I think we'll dive deeper into like how those things and those experiences shaped who I am now, and that allows me to be really effective, in my work. But for me, I wanted to share. Geber Mate is like icon legend, my favorite author, and there's a quote where he talks about the importance of childhood. He says, in a nutshell, if kids get what they need in early childhood, they're going to be okay. If they don't get what they need in early childhood for whatever reason, they're going to have great challenges. And there's a lot of people who criticize the simplicity of this quote, but um, for those people, I would say, you know what? Why? It's a general statement, and general statements exist for us to explore, not for us to live in a black and white box. So this is in a nutshell, and I think it can be said for anyone. Like if you have a safe, nurtured, and secure childhood, generally in how the world operates as it is, you will have a pretty okay life.
Hmm.
And if there are not a lot of opportunities to learn about emotional intelligence, build comfort in your body, experience healthy, functioning relationships, there is a reality that you're going to have great challenges. And I think that that's not because um, of anything necessarily between you or the parent, but rather just how the system operates and how the system exists. So as much as it's like our job to do our healing work and it's on parents to make sure that they're doing their best as caregivers, it's also like society and community to look at how we've built society and how we make, you know, folks work 40 hours a week and then try to parent and then have to pay all these like there's so many roots to so many other things there, and it's I think they're all a part of the dialogue, but that's my start there.
Maybe you want to start there. So, what did that quote or said? Is it a quote? Yeah, that you said. I can't remember the
Yeah,
name of
yeah.
the person. What did it do for you when you first saw it? Like, where did you internalize it?
I think for me when I had first saw it, it just made sense, you know. It kind of, because when you see that somebody is validating the challenges you face, you kind of
Hmm.
can connect the dots and then you begin to do the work. Um, but generally speaking, I think at least for me, we there wasn't that acknowledgement. Like it was just kind of what was normal to us. So even though we faced these challenges, we immediately thought, well, this has nothing like this has nothing to do with that. This is just a challenge because I feel the challenge. And with that comes a lot of insecurities, needs for external validation, all that kind of stuff. But when you read something like this and you're like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, all of those foundational years really shaped me. And so when you can be empowered by a quote like this, it then allows you to dive deep and go into the work.
Hmm. Definitely. And maybe we should also acknowledge the fact that as messy as it was, um, we wouldn't be who we are today without it. So there is that balance on the scale. Me being a Libra, obviously, I'm always looking at the balance, and it's like, you know, although it might have seemed to the outside society that it was super, super messy and dysfunctional, and don't get me wrong, there was dysfunction. It
Mhm.
just, I'm also grateful for that too. Is
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can have both. And so brief background for anyone who's listening. So Ty and I, like we have a deep rooted many legacies, I think, of intergenerational trauma. And I say that because, like, my grandma and my grandparent, bless their heart, they were healing on my grandma's side from alcoholism. And then on my grandpa's side, you know, growing up as a Black man, you know, in Nova Scotia, like, there's so much that I think occurred in his early life. And then when they came together, they brought life into the world. And then we've got the intersections of the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children. We've got all of these people just put in this system and had some intense experiences and maybe not the opportunity to heal it. So I mean, in comes Ty. How old was mom when she had you, Ty?
So mom was 15 when she got pregnant with me,
Yeah.
and then she was pregnant for that whole year up until September 22nd,
Yeah.
turned 16, and then on October 2nd she had me. Right. So I mean, yeah, it was, she was young. She was super young.
Yeah. And it's
Right.
like I can't even imagine. I mean, what was I doing at 16? I think I was in online school. I was living on the Cloud Trail. I couldn't even like. finish school, let alone raise a
Yeah, think about raising a child. No, and I mean, the story. Um, Nan had jumped in to help out, right? And so she took me for the first 6 years,
Mhm.
um, which is also a blessing and a curse because it's like, why didn't you give me up?
Yeah.
But then also, I'm glad you kept me in our dysfunction.
Yeah, yeah. When then and then your time concludes when then I enter the picture. 5 years later, right? Your time
Yeah,
with Nan?
yeah. So yeah, like 5, 6 years later, you entered the picture, and I think at that point, Mom's 21 or 22,
Yeah.
and I think she saw a future with your father, also.
Mm.
You know what I
Mm.
mean? In some respect, right?
Yeah.
And so she took me back, I guess, too. But I don't know if you know this actually. So I found out years later that John played a big role. And for those who don't know, John's our grandma's basically common law husband.
Yeah.
And apparently he didn't want, because he had Pete, right? And so he didn't want us growing up, because Pete was younger than me, to be my younger uncle.
Oh,
He thought it was going to be too much of a story to have to explain, which is kind of understandable. You know
yeah.
what I mean? And I think it was a combination of more than just that.
Yeah.
But I was told that later, I guess.
Mm.
From Mom told me actually
So, like, a bit of fear around him.
that it was just, yeah, like that it was just too hard of a story to explain, which it is kind of weird, right? Like Pete's younger than me and he's apparently my uncle. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's like, and it's so like, what does that make like. So I get what he was trying to. As a man, I understand it today so much deeper, because that's like what maybe he was trying to set up for family life and what he thought life should look like, and
Mhm.
he didn't ask for uh nephew grandson. You know?
Well, I mean, but he never even asked to be a grandpa. Like, for those listening,
Well,
he
that's
is
just it.
significantly younger than my grandma. So
Yeah,
I don't know if he ever even wanted to be a grandpa.
yeah. Yeah, and for those of you listening, you're starting to probably peel the layers to the dysfunction we're talking about here, right? Because we're like, yeah, we always have to explain like who this person is to this relationship, because our family, bless it, is super big. But
Yeah.
as most of you know, the bigger the family, the bigger the dysfunction a lot of the time.
Yeah, and so many layers, like, even that we still see it to this day, like all of our cousins, and then like we're actually learning of like more family. I'm like, what? We're related to so many people. I'm like,
Hmm.
really? So
Hmm.
it's a big family, and I always wonder. I'm just like, why? I guess maybe like contraceptives were less of a thing back then. Like, why did you guys like? Because obviously, I mean, I have like, we don't have kids, so like,
And we're the only two.
yeah, yeah. So it's like, whereas all of our relatives, and I think, no shade to them, like, are on different parts of their healing journeys,
Yeah.
are active with children, and yeah, I don't know. Why do you not have kids? What's
Well, so what's crazy is that if you remember, um, my like second serious relationship when I
Yeah.
lived at Auntie Dean's in the
Oh, yeah,
basement
yeah.
there. Yeah, so she actually got pregnant, and I was for it, but she ended up terminating the pregnancy. And if she hadn't, I'd have like a 12-year-old right now.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy to think about?
Wow.
Yeah, like and how life would just be so different, right? And um yeah, like that it's kind of hard to explain why I don't. I think maybe a little bit of luck, you know. What I mean? But at the same time,
Condoms? Condoms?
yeah, and just like I don't know. I really put a big emphasis to every relationship or any girlfriend that I ever had, that I was like, listen, I absolutely have to be financially stable before I bring a child into this life. Like it's just something that was so important to me,
Mhm.
and rightfully so, right? Like, I mean, with all the stresses and stuff that can come up. I mean, I'm looking at my one of my best friends I grew up with, Ryan. He has 5 kids.
Yeah.
and and just the everyday sickness and stuff with his son, and it's just like the amount of stuff he's dealing with. So on top of not having to deal with a financial burden,
Hmm.
you know, I think it's just I think we should have I think there's a responsibility we should have
Yeah. Yeah.
to having a child. I mean, I'm honestly kind of pro you should have to get a license to have a child.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I think that and here's the thing. I know that sounds initially like
Yeah.
hot take. It's a hot take, obviously,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I'm not saying like everyone has a license to drive, and isn't that just aren't we holding other people's lives in hands when we drive?
Yeah.
Y-
Yeah.
and it's pretty simple to get a license. I'm not
Yeah.
saying it has to be a crazy, crazy thing, but like, a simple like, okay, what have you been doing the last 5 years? Are, are you financially stable? How are you on the mental health spectrum?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like little tiny things. And I
How's your
get,
emotional intelligence?
yeah, like, like, are, but at the same time too, there are holes in that too. You know what I mean? That like
Yeah.
once you actually start to dive into, so it's like, I get why we don't want to take away people's freedoms and right
Okay.
to.
And do we trust the government to really do a good job? Like, probably not 100% of the time
Mhm,
because they're
mhm,
human and fallible. But I hear you in the sense like, how do we how do we build responsibility before people bringing a life into the world is huge. Like,
mhm,
when I chose to give my sperm to that couple, it was like I had to be sure that that child would grow up in a stable, loving home with a wide network of supports.
mhm,
That they were both folks who I trusted to have a level of self-awareness, emotional intelligence, financial stability, and general wellness, and also Indigenous culture was a big part of too my decision because people have asked me before for I think I told you about that girl on Facebook who from our childhood. Anyway, she's like, "Hey RJ, can you give me your sperm?" And I was like, "Yeah, like well what's up? Like what do you think? Like why would you it's always I always love why. Like I'm like, "Why do you think you'd want me?" She's like, "Well, because you're so hot." And I was like, "Okay, well, I'm not going to give you my sperm because like clearly you haven't done the work." Whereas when the
yeah,
other folks had reached out to me, it was I had known about it for many, many months, and there was a lot of
yeah,
discussion, and
yeah.
there was a lot of open communication and dialogue, and I think that made me like feel really secure. And there's a lot of trust in who they both are and how they both show up in the world. So
I'm
anyway,
sure.
there I'm down. I'm down for
Sorry.
licenses. I'm down for licenses.
Are too? You are?
In the sense that, but I wouldn't want a government intervention. Like I just want
Yeah.
I would love some sort of accountability in community for folks to bring in children because it's a
Oh,
big thing.
licenses too. Driving licenses are usually provincial things through the
Yeah.
registry. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So it's like, yeah, it is government, but at the same time too, like, it could be brought down to a level of just like, yeah, you just got to go in, ask some questions, show some proof of stuff. Do you have a stable home? How long have you lived there?
Yeah.
Just some little tiny things that would just be some indicators of like, hey, and then not somebody to say no, denied, but
Hmm.
somebody to act like a place where people could actually go to speak with like counselors and be like, say, just like you said to that girl about why do you want to do this,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then diving in deeper, and then maybe they can help them to understand like, hey, well, is this just like some external need that you're trying to
Hmm.
fulfill for purpose in your life, or is this something that like in your life that you absolutely want to do with your life? This was your dream, was to be a mother or
Yeah.
a father.
Yeah.
So
But and there's general yeah, and I think that like obviously there's a lot of nuance to like the situations with which where people end up pregnant unintentionally and things like that. Like we're not
mhm,
talking about those, but generally speaking, when you're like seeking to bring life into the world, it's a huge responsibility. And I'm
mhm.
curious, like, okay, now connecting it to you and like your story and your lived experience, how do you think like how are some ways that like things that happened in your childhood have showed up in your adult life?
So a lot of what has happened with me becoming a man has only really happened since 30.
Mm,
So I really, contribute my 20s to just literally, I'd say a waste of time, but at the same time, it was needed.
mhm.
And as you know, I was in that relationship. my last relationship, that was, the longest one I'd been in for, 5, 6 years. And coming out of that, and, even though I knew that we weren't a good fit, it was things were starting to show up. And like, that's when the anxiety, or like the panic attack, started happening.
Mhm.
And that's when that sleep stuff I was telling you about,
Yep.
where like before I go the nocturnal, I can't
Panic
remember.
attacks. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're basically panic attacks, but it's just like another reformed word for it.
They're a
And
bitch of a panic attack because you're like, I just fell asleep. Yeah, like it's like the
yeah,
fucking worst.
yeah, right. And like, so these things were starting to show up, and it was like, I my perspective now is that like that was just literally the whole situation was God,
Mhm.
and him trying to be like, like, no, this is wrong, like, and I have to put you through this in order for you to get to where you should be and where you need to be.
Yeah.
But as for like the things that happened when I was younger
Mhm.
and how they're showing up now, I haven't fully connected those dots yet. I haven't fully, because like there are some like there's some like big stuff, you know what I mean, that like would probably be, a little too provocative for this podcast. You know what I
Yeah, yeah.
mean? Like that, I'm not essentially afraid to share, but it's just that like we're trying to probably keep this, PG for the first few episodes, right?
Never. No, it's not. No,
Yeah.
I think it's okay wherever you go, but it's like it's just interesting to see like what the journey was to get to those things too. Like I think that's really something interesting for people who get to listen.
Yeah. So for me, it just really was pretty lonely, to be
Mm,
honest. Do you know what I
mhm,
mean? And that was the journey. It was figuring out things for myself. There was the big thing I contribute is not having a male figure around. So
mhm.
there's people that I tried to attach to, like, Wayne Dyer, for instance. Read his stuff when I was really early on. People were like, reading this, like, and I didn't even actually end up finishing his books, but
And mom always had self-help books in the house, I will say.
yeah, she did, you know what I mean? So she was always trying to better herself too, and that um played a significant role into, I think, into, another part of who we are today, and on the positive side, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Because like we always did see that she was trying,
Yeah.
even though it was, the mistakes happened. She was always trying. And I remember actually listening to your last episode there, and you
Mhm.
mentioned talking about the one that significantly stood out male
Mm.
wise. And you're right, you're obviously talking about Mike.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, you're obviously talking about Mike. And so obviously I was 5 years older than you.
Yeah, so you remember more.
I do. I remember a lot. Like I really do. And but at the same time, from what I do remember, he was very stoic and very like, you know, there wasn't too much influence
Mhm,
directly. It was
mhm,
more subconsciously, I think. And it was like, oh, okay, this is what like for me anyway, like this is what a man is supposed to be.
mm,
So, but I can't really recall him being there for me. And maybe he
mm.
would have better memories than I would. You know what I mean? And like, but again, what do you really know at that age is also the thing.
Yeah, and I think well, and experiences too, like it's interesting because where you were at developmentally, you were at a place where you were developing your independence, whereas I
Mhm.
was still in a place where I was still like nurturing and like relying on someone else, right? So for
Yeah.
me, I always think of like and the grandparents, like they made me that farmhouse with my little Plesk animals. I have my
Yeah.
McDonald's maker,
Yeah.
which now that I think about it, McDonald's food is trash, but we were celebrating it then. Men in Black, I remember having like, so I remember, and a lot of the love, I guess, that I think of and the impact of that was actually through receiving gifts. So I
Mhm.
can actually speak to either receiving gifts and presents, like that they were there. Like
Yeah.
that's really what
Yeah.
I think it's what stands out for me from that period of time.
Yeah. No, and that was definitely happening. My wheels are kind of turning here because I'm really trying to go back to your question here of like, how do I pinpoint the journey, like, of what you're
Yeah.
actually asking me? I know I
Mhm.
keep like kind of veering off slightly, but it's again, it's just difficult for me to actually like connect the dots, I think, to like what exact traumas are showing up today,
Mm,
and um, another thing that I watch you do was on, I think, one of your TikTok reels or whatever, and you're just being like, it's okay, like, just acknowledge it and accept it,
yeah.
so that has really helped with the panic stuff, to
Mm,
just like acknowledging and accepting, what I mean, as it's happening and when it's happening. I think that the growing part for me moving forward is to actually maybe dive back into those places,
mm,
like to actually try and connect those dots. But then at the same time, there's a part of
mhm,
me that's like, I have to let that. I'm always like, let's let that die. I'm always, even when I'm talking with mom, I'm like, let's, like, why are we going back to the past? Like, we have to move on. We have to
mhm,
move on.
mhm,
And again, the scale, the balance, like, where does the balance lie? And what do you think? Like, do you think that I should be trying to connect those dots, or should I be like, no, let's just move on and try and focus and deal with what's present to better shape my future?
mhm. I think like I think it's like like healing is so obviously nuanced and it's really agile in the sense that it's always shifting, like it's always evolving. And so I think like for some of us that means, going backwards and diving deep into the work. Whereas for some of us, what gets us through is through focusing on what it is to be and working to build that. So I don't think either are wrong. I think that we make choices based on certain things that show up, how we want to respond to them. And that's like the beauty of being human is that you get that choice of like what tools work for me and what tools don't work. And so if you're saying like no, I like because for you, you feel like you focus more on what's to come and like creating the
Mhm.
future. But then my brain says, but is there something scary about sitting in it and staying in it that you are trying to avoid?
Mm.
And so in that, is there an opportunity? That's kind of where I think my head goes when I hear that.
Yeah, and I mean, which is why I am open to the notion. I'm not closed at all to that. Even just what you said right there was very insightful, and I'll take it. You know what I mean, to consideration, to being like, okay, so how am I feeling? Because as you know, sometimes you have to sit for a bit and some time, and then it's like to really uh, triangulate is my big word, your emotion, right? Like to pinpoint it to like, oh, okay, yeah, like I am afraid,
Yeah.
and acknowledge it. So I yeah.
And when you don't like, and I'll speak to myself, like I don't have like when I think of my resilience, my ability to continue on, like I so attribute that to mom's strength and courage to continue on and overcome things. But I think the lack there was like the opportunity there was really about the emotional intelligence and being okay with sitting with discomfort. I think that that was missing. I always think like I'm a runner. Like I love, obviously I've lived in like 100 different places. And I do love it. And I think it's beautiful. It's why I love to travel. It's why I love new experiences, why it's easy for me to build new relationships. But there was a lot of running away from discomfort, and we didn't have a lot of opportunities to sit in challenging things before we acted. It was always, chaos occurred, run on to the next, chaos occurred, on to the next. Bills weren't paid, leaving the lease, da da da. And then what we would do is then we would justify it at the other end. Right. So like I'm a pro justifier. I could justify any fucking thing. Thank you, mom. That ability. And it's a strength for sure, but unchecked, it can become a quick problem and you can become really, I think, toxic in certain instances. And so that's something that I'm missing is like, how do I sit in it and not say anything about it? Like
Mhm.
that's the discomfort. And mine started like was the beginning of last year when I think I started to feel my feelings physically again. Like I spent my 20s just like numb to it all and just like helping people, doing dance, traveling, and it was great. And there were moments, like there were obviously those moments when I was really fucked up on some substances where those emotional releases were there, but I wasn't at a place where I wanted to actually like do the work yet. And then it was the beginning of last year when I started to face I had went through that breakup, and the impact was so heavy for the first time. It was wild, and like I was feeling everything, and I couldn't ground myself anywhere. And I was like, I remember one day driving an Evo down like across the bridge and like just crying. I couldn't stop crying, and then I'm like, get to my house, and I'm like pouring a glass of wine to regulate, like just unhealthy coping mechanisms. I was just so overwhelmed by feeling everything, and I won't say
Mhm.
that I don't feel things any less, but now I'm starting to build a dictionary of like, okay, when I have anxiety, this is how it shows up, and this is a temporary thing, and here, and
Yeah.
sometimes I need to explore it. And back to your point, actually, about like you're in your relationship. Like I remember in that past relationship, I felt anxious the entire time. I was always feeling anxiety, and I couldn't quite pinpoint it. And same with um, the one who rhymes with rock. We can't say his name here. The same thing. I remember just feeling deeply uncomfortable the whole time. But then again, back to that child and that need for this relationship and the core of kind of fear of being alone. I didn't want to give up something that I had, and that means I had lost, friends. I didn't
Yeah.
lost them, thank God. They're still in the picture. But anyway, there was so much to that. And to connect it to your point is the anxiety can sometimes be a compass to say, hey, we need to pay attention, because in my current relationship, the anxiety is like, I feel it when we need to talk about something. And I'm
Mhm.
like, and I can feel it in front. I'm like, oh, like you need to say something, or like something is something there. And I'm like, I feel it then. And that's because I'm uncomfortable with having sometimes deeper emotional conversations. And
Especially when you're not
anyway,
ready for them
yeah,
or
and also
prepared.
case this, I'm gonna say, I was thinking about, so I wrote this down. Like, do you ever find this in your relationships, like that you have really high expectations of other people in relationships?
Yeah, and I didn't realize that so much so until my last one,
Yeah.
because that literally I think is what damaged the relationship so much. Like it was, and it wasn't until after that relationship. I was just gonna say, isn't it so interesting that like how romantic relationships end up, being the catalyst for us to get to a place of like, oh my god, you know what I mean? Like now I'm feeling all these emotions when they end,
Yeah.
right? Like and um, another person I can't remember. I wish I could remember these people's names. They say great things, but I can't remember their names. And it's basically that like you are the reflection of who you date,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's like the person you're dating is a reflection of yourself. You know what I mean? And that
Hmm.
and that's why they say it's so important to take time after at the end of a relationship, because if you don't and like actually dive in and try and grow and heal, you're just going to bring who you were in that relationship into the next one.
Yeah.
Um, but back to your question there, it's very like sorry, just having a bit of a brain fart there. Um,
Expectations. Why do you think we're so? And I'm saying we because I'll tell you a story after. But yeah.
oh yeah, the expectations. Yeah, sorry. What I was putting on her that I didn't realize I was this like immense pressure for her to be the very best version of herself, and so we disguise it as like I'm doing so good for you here, right?
Hmm.
Like by trying to hold you up to this high standard, but
Hmm.
essentially it can be toxic because it's like you're telling them like you need to be somebody else in order to be with me,
Yeah.
right? And that's not very accepting, right? So
And where do
I
you?
think that's a huge contributor to my last relationship there.
And if you had to connect the dots, just based on your observations now, like where do you think that comes from?
So I think that it comes from a place of our own self-worth,
Mm,
and not having the adequate validation, as you were saying, when
mhm.
we were younger
Yeah.
to lift our own selves up because we weren't getting it from them. So we think that like essentially we learned what not to do.
Hmm.
So like how not to be. So it's like
Hmm.
when we get into these relationships, we're like we know better.
Yeah.
It's almost like this higher self of like ego. It really is ego
Yeah.
at the end of the day, right? But it's also trauma
Yeah.
because it's what we didn't get when we needed it. And so now we're sitting here being like, well, because I know what it's like to not get it and what the outcome's going to be, this is what you need to do in order to have a different outcome.
Hmm. Hmm. And that's I'm really just hypothesis
Look at
this
that.
I can't say that word. Hypothesizing with you is like I almost wonder if it's a control thing because
Mhm.
things always felt so out of control, and arguably things are 110% out of control. And so when you can hold harsh to an ideal self, this is what's better than you can have some control. And so and the reason why it comes up is because with all the transition with moving in with my partner and being in a new city that's bilingual and I barely speak French, and by barely I mean like I don't. Like I don't. Anyway, like all of those stresses of new work, new role, new community, I found myself getting my expectations so high. And Fred came home on Friday and he was like, I wanted to go back to like how we were because like he's like, you're just kind of like having these really high expectations and really like almost mean. And I was like, oh my God, I am being mean. And it's because I'm actually being really harsh on myself. I'm not allowing myself to like just realize this is a whole lot of change and it's okay and I can take time. I'm not in a rush. And so
Mhm.
sometimes then when we are in relationship, we like, of course, those closest to us, we take those same expectations and we put them on them. I'm like, well, you need to also be up to this top tier standard that I'm not going to meet and you're not going to
Mhm.
meet. But if
No,
you don't meet it, then you're the bad guy because again, it's because then I can take the weight off myself, the heaviness that I carry with me day in and day out as I try to push for like this perfectionist fantasy or like to do everything the right way or well, I don't know.
the right way. And here's somebody I can uh, talk about who I remember their name, Brene Brown.
Mm,
So after as I after the relationship, and I told you I was reading that book, you're like, oh yeah, I read that like a decade ago, and I was like, oh, you're already on this, like, okay, like. But for me, that was the first book I'd ever finished in my
yeah.
entire life, and that book really, really helped me in realizing what I'm talking about in that last relationship about how I wasn't accepting that person for just who they are and being able to accept myself for who I am.
Was
You
it
know,
was it the gifts of imperfection, that one? Or was it the
Atlas of the
already hmm?
Atlas of the Heart.
Oh, Atlas of the Heart. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So um, that's what really helped me the most out of that book was that like, oh, okay, I have to accept people, and it's helped in other relationships too, i.e., with mom,
Yeah.
because I'm like reluctantly and frustratingly trying to get to a place where I'm like, yeah, like, okay, I just have to accept, like, if I want this relationship to be what it
Mhm.
can be, I have to remember that, like, I need to accept people for who they are, and not
Mhm.
try to control or change. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And control was a great word that you brought up because um, my ex, she said, it's just it feels controlling. You know what I mean? Towards the end, she used the word control, and I'm sitting here like a smack in the face, like I'm not controlling. Like, what do you, you know what I mean? I'm like,
Yeah.
what are you talking about? And it's like I didn't really quite see because obviously when you're in it, you don't see it as clearly.
And control, I honestly say like control is a manifestation of anxiety because you're trying to regulate. And when you're taught to regulate through control, then it makes sense when you face other experiences it just doesn't work. Like
Yeah.
we're gonna come off that way. And I think for me, that's why I always am like, when I think of those moments, I try to kind of create like an inner dialogue of like what my inner child is. And it comes back to I had a somatic therapist work with me once through my anxiety back in April. And we were talking and exploring through like who is that inner child and what are they doing, and trying to create a relationship. So like literally in my journal, like talking to that inner child. And so in those moments where I feel like, oh, I need to make a comment or I'm holding to this high standard, I'm taking back to being like, I think, did you post? No, someone posted this. Oh, Kurt posted this where he said it was Oprah and she was talking about you. The only person we disappoint when someone lets us down is ourselves, because I hope I catch it right. Is like when we put these high expectations on someone else and then they let us down, it didn't change anything, really for them. It changed for us. And then we build our own kind of disappointment, I think is how it
Mhm.
resonated for me. So when I think of it in an example, it's like if I say, this is the expectation here, and it's based on my perception, and it has nothing to do with you, and then you let me down, I've just created my own suffering for no fucking reason when I could have said, how do you want to show up? Okay, so you're showing up like this. As long as that's not causing me harm or anything like that, then like live your best life, go on, do your damn thing. And that's okay. And I think that's like the hardest lesson, but the most recurring lesson, at least right now,
Mhm. Mhm.
for me, of childhood and how it's showing up
In
here.
today. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, there's like, I think there's just so many pieces, but I always tell people like, if you're looking or you're at a place where you're like looking at your childhood and trying to connect the dots, like I think the best place to start is really just having a conversation.
Mhm.
And it feels weird. There's one exercise, actually, I don't know if you've ever tried this. And it's like goes into like developmental psychology and like right and left brain. But you basically have a dialogue with your inner child, but you write with your opposite hand. So you write like a question like, how are you doing today? And then you answer with your left hand. And it like
Wow.
visually, it already looks like a child's writing, honestly. But
Yeah. Yeah.
they say, and a lot of people have found a lot of value in that, is it gets you into a conversation. I think once you're able to have that conversation, then you're able to be like, okay, well, what's the shit we need to unpack? And
Yeah. Yeah.
how do we want to unpack it? Do we want to unpack it in a way to say like this is the lesson and we don't want to bring that into our future self, or do we need to go explore deeper?
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes our body needs to heal, because our body, like unreleased emotion, just stores physically in our body. So do we need to like do
Mhm.
some somatic therapy? Like, do we need to drink? And
You need to-
like the journey is nuanced, and like I mean, obviously we come from a long line of alcohol consumers, and like
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes you need to numb. I don't think numbing is the worst thing, because life is hard sometimes, and some people are gonna
Yeah.
numb, and that's how you cope. But regardless, I say start talk to them, talk to that inner child, give them a
Talk to
name.
that left hand. Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. I like that. Talk to that left hand. Um, that just reminded me of someone else that I wanted to give a shout out to is Phil Stutz.
Okay.
Did you end up watching that documentary that Jonah Hill did
Mm-mm.
about?
I
Okay,
know. I want to.
why? Come on, bro. Like,
I need to do better.
you need to do better. Yeah, you need to do better. I I bring it up because essentially another part of it too that I'm hearing when you're talking about using that left hand, it brings like a visual representation too to when you're like reading it back or like when you're looking at it to being like, holy crap, I'm actually talking to my say kid self or another version of myself that
Mhm.
I don't want to acknowledge because just out of sheer like I don't want to write with this hand because of how it's going to look and then going
Mm.
back to control, right? Like you don't control how it looks. So it's like, but then having that visualization. And the thing with Phil Stutz was that I took from it is a whole realm of visualization therapy. That's
Mhm.
essentially all he's doing. He gets you to
Mhm.
sit in a room and like actually visualize a scenario in order
Mhm.
to kind of heal. And I think I'm doing an oversimplification of it, but it was just so great for me when I watched it because, as you know, I'm a huge nerd, and I'm always talking about, Star Wars and like how that actually helps me. But like, I'm not kidding. When I have that nocturnal stuff happening,
Hmm.
I have this one Star Wars theme music on YouTube that I have played probably over 100 times, and I literally just will play that when I'm laying in bed, and it's like the Force music playing,
Yeah.
and I just genuinely visualize like I'm, Luke, and like I'm meditating and feeling the Force, right?
Mm.
And I know that's a bit non, it's fiction, it's not real or whatever, but I mean, hey, whatever works, right? And we're all individuals, and
And I honestly say, like, I really admire those movies. Like that energy is a real thing. That
yeah,
story came from a real place that I think we can tap into.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
And I know you didn't watch the Obi-Wan show on Disney Plus. Yeah, I know you didn't, right? But so the reason I bring it up is because the Force has never really been explained, right?
Mm.
And little young Leia asks Obi-Wan, like, what is it like? What does it feel like? And he's like, do you know when you're in a dark room, you're scared, right? And she's like, yeah. And he's like, it's kind of like when you turn the. How do you feel when you turn the light on? She's like, safe. And he's like, it's kind of like that.
Hmm.
And I thought that was just such beautiful writing to depict, what the Force is. Like, the moment that you turn the light on, you feel safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he says the Force feels like.
Mm.
And yeah, for me, it's extremely therapeutic. Like I can feel my whole body energized when I'm listening to that music. And sure enough, it's like anything. Sometimes you just need to turn your brain to this over here for a second. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden, your symptoms go away.
And something bigger, yeah, bigger than yourself. Like you can get so
Hmm.
lost in the madness of the brain. And so sometimes it's getting into the body. Music, there's a when you're hyper aroused and your nervous system is like activated, the it really looks to like our more like the limbic part of our system is what's really activated. And so we can't logically communicate the same way once that part's really working and activated. So one of the things they say is you can listen to music because music can
Hmm.
communicate and can create a sense of calm when you're feeling those. So yeah, music, whatever works. If you want to go with Star Wars, whatever that journey is, because I think the reality is we are interconnected, and like that Star Wars, the impact that that has had for so many people across the world, like it comes from a real authentic place, that
Really.
can be, and you can say fiction, but like we can say the same for the church. We can say the same for so many things. But when we're able to get outside of ourselves and into the bigger interconnection, like we find safety. We turn the light on. And the same is true when we're doing the work, is that, as much as it can feel scary, it will feel uncomfortable. You will feel a whole range of emotions. When you turn the light on to that room where that inner child is, it's a really beautiful opportunity to continue to evolve and become your best self. And I
Hmm.
think in like wrapping up our dialogue, like I hope that everyone who's listened, like hope there were some moments, some things that you can tap into as we explored and talked about our childhoods and what our experience has looked like. Maybe there's some tips that work for you, or maybe there's something how we explored something that is of value. Um, and if there wasn't, well, I'm sorry. But no, I think there's a lot of really good value. And Ty, I really always appreciate our conversations and our dialogues. And I'm grateful to have a family affair for episode 2 of this Glorious Mess podcast.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, bro. I love you, and I would do it anytime. I'm glad you were my first.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm so
Yeah,
glad to stay well, everyone who's listening. And yeah, we'll check you on the next episode, coming to you in 1 week's time.